Welcome, everybody. It is February 2024. My name is Mike Tresca. I am your host and current committee chair for the CAR-PGA. I'm very excited to talk to our guests, but I have a couple of housekeeping items that we want to make sure we cover. We are back on track, as you've noticed. So we went from January. At the end of December, we actually didn't have a meeting. We're back in January. We had a great guest, and now we're in February, and we're going to keep that up through June. So we are booked solid, which we're very excited about. We didn't always have that as the case. I'm also excited to talk about voting for the board. Before we get to the board, I think we should just mention one thing, which simply put is that we have two new members joining us. One of them is Dave Hartless, and the other is Ian Turner. And more importantly, Dave Hartless is running for one of the board memberships. We've sent around bios of everybody, so I encourage you to look at that, especially if you're new to Dave or to anybody else, myself included. But hopefully, you'll get a chance to look at all those folks and vote for them because we really do want you to vote. By far, the most important thing you can do is vote. So we really hope you will do that. That helps us. That helps the organization. It helps everybody. So if you do nothing else, please, 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 definitely vote. So that's one thing. The other thing is we uh, we are continuing to grow the CAR-PGA as always. So this is our little plug. Please connect with us on Facebook if you're not following the Facebook page. Obviously, hopefully you're looking at this on YouTube, but if you aren't, by all means, please do. And we absolutely encourage join the LinkedIn group. We have quite a few other social media channels. And we are very excited to continue to grow that because our goal, of course, as always, I think on Facebook and YouTube, is to grow those channels by at least one person a month, which sounds modest, but slow and steady wins the race. And we have managed to keep that up so far. So that is our housekeeping. Without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our guest, Brandon O'Brien. Brandon, I'm going to add your pin. There we go. Hello. How are you?
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm
Thank
very
you.
good. I'm glad to be here.
Fantastic. You're so gracious for doing. I think we've had this scheduled for months, right? I think we've from last year, right?
Yes, we were in emails trying to make this happen for quite some time, and then, if I recall correctly, how it happened is literally you were just like, "Are you free this day?" And I was like, "Finally, a day I'm free. Let's just do it now." And that's how we settled on today. So I'm very excited to be here.
Oh, we're thrilled. I'm glad that you were able to make it. It is not always easy to mention, and sometimes what we end up doing is because we schedule them out in advance, we have to. But you've been time, so I appreciate you joining us, and I'm excited to dig into your background. I'm calling you a multi-hyphenate. I don't know if you want that phrase, but I'm calling you that. So I'd love for you to just sort of give us a little overview of what you do. And then let's dig into sort of how you got into gaming, because obviously that's our bias here. We're interested. But just tell us what you sound like you're doing everything. So let's hear what you're doing. What do you do?
I mean, I am in fact doing a lot. So I am a speculative poet, performance poet, speculative fiction writer, uh, a I have experience as a poetry teaching artist, and as of most recently, as of maybe the early 2020s, I am now a tabletop game designer as well. And I also do podcasting, including Tabletop AP. So yeah, wow. When I actually think about all of it, I'm doing so much. Um, but yeah, that's I think that's everything.
Yeah, just a few things. It is funny. Podcasting, I think, is part of the territory now. So if you do some of these other things, podcasting probably. I
hmm
think do you have a YouTube channel? Do you have a channel?
I have a YouTube channel that presently doesn't have any content on it, but the goal is to
Hmm.
have content there, obviously. So yeah.
I have no doubt. Yeah. So multi channels for sure come with the territory, but that's fantastic. So yeah, I wasn't kidding. When we talked about you are creativity unbound, as I like to say. I don't think one genre can contain you. So that I think that's fantastic. So for the gaming piece, if you could sort of take us
hmm
through kind of like just, how did you get in? So you said that was relatively recent. What
Yeah.
made you decide to get into that? How did you get into, how did you find yourself from all those other really amazing fields into tabletop gaming?
hmm So, um, the very interesting thing about that story is when I think very deeply about it, I hadn't really been doing anything in tabletop even as a consumer until fairly recently. Like it wasn't until like sometime after high school um that I got into more than just playing Magic the Gathering with the two other people who knew Magic the Gathering because a lot of people around me weren't into that. Only a handful of people that I knew were into Dungeons and Dragons, and very few of them had the books, so I couldn't gather with them and play. And the folks who did were like kind of far away from where I lived, so it was just a thing that I was aware of that I knew that I would like, and didn't really dive into it until like sometime around university. Um, and I was like, this is very cool. I enjoy this. That's grand. And that was happening while I had started maneuvering from just writing poetry for myself to actually starting to perform, making that actually my career at the time, which led to me discovering that I can also do science fiction and fantasy writing as well because I was starting to make connections with SFF writers in the Caribbean who were encouraging me that that was a thing that I could do. And I went, yes, okay, I'll do this. And that was around 2015. I started seriously making SFF a part of my career. I started selling some short stories, was working on my what is now my debut collection. Um, and around that time, I was just in a Slack group with another writer who is now also a game designer, Michael R. Underwood, who had just suggested in the Slack group, hey, if anybody's interested in doing tabletop stuff, Avery Alder, the designer of Dream Askew and Dream Apart, Monster Hearts, and so many other brilliant things, was opening her emerging designers mentorship at that point in time, was just taking applications. And I was like, this sounds cool. I don't know what I would do for this, but I would just throw something together and see how it works. And that was the initial submission for what is now Sound Clash. And I when I made it, I was just like, this is cool. I'm probably just gonna get some notes on whether this is cool or not. And then I'll just go back to pretending this never happened. And then Avery was like, this is really rad. I want to help you make this thing. Um, and that led to me like learning so much from Avery about the process that was really inspiring and intriguing to me that I was like, I want to actually see if I could make this happen. Maybe not as a career, but I'd like to make a couple small things and see if people like those things. And whether people liking those things could help me pay my bills as well. Um, and then I discovered I just really like tabletop. Like I like playing, obviously, which is a thing that I already know. And I'm glad that being in this space now gives me an opportunity to meet more people who like playing and be in a position where I can share that play with more people. But I also discovered that making a game is also fun. Like there is something intriguing and gear turning about making a tabletop role-playing game and getting to the point where it looks like everything clicks. Like there is this is a terrible metaphor because I cannot make a watch. But the way that I make this joke to myself is that I technically can't make a perfect RPG either. But when you look at a game that you're working on and you make that minor adjustment to a mechanic, or you make that minor textual note to how someone is supposed to interact with something, and then the words on the page start clicking like gears, I'm like,
Mhm.
that's rad. I feel like I've accomplished something. I feel like I've made a small machine for someone to play in. And that's actually really fun to figure out. Especially because I'm not really gifted in anything other than writing. I'm not good at math. Ask me how dice work. I don't know. I just know I like having dice in my hands. But there is something really interesting about finding the ways in which certain interactions immediately start looping into each other in fascinating and intriguing ways, and then seeing players interact with those things in other more interesting ways that you hadn't initially foreseen. And I really want to keep being in that mode as often as possible. So yeah, that's how I'm here. And I'm
Fantastic.
particularly grateful that because because a lot of tabletop RPGs already lean very heavily into science fiction and fantasy tropes, that I'm also in a position to like very easily do a lot of fiction for those things as well, which is the part that also gives me joy. That like for Dream Rescue and Dream Apart, when it was being kickstarted, I wrote fiction for a supplemental book for the game. I wrote I got to write fiction for Magic the Gathering. I got to write fiction for Pathfinder. I've written fiction for the Blue Rose RPG, and I like being able to just know that I can do both. That people can ask me at any point in time to be available for any kind of text is really refreshing in this space as well.
It's huge, right? I mean, it's so interesting because I think you could argue game design is every one of these fields, right? It is there's speculative fiction because if there's a setting, there's a part of that. Um, certainly, you know, when you approach game design, it's so broad based. People bring to it. There are people who come at it very technically. I'm sure there are. I'm not one of them. But I imagine there is definitely folks who the parts of that explore and then bring it into the game design field. So it's fascinating because to your point, obviously there's crossover, and certainly they are sister genres in many cases, at least with speculative fiction for sure. So you said that that helps. Like, is there particular ways that that helps? Obviously, writing, being able to say I can write the fiction for a game matters tremendously. Is that influencing your? Are you coming at your game design from a speculative fiction world first, or are you coming with the fiction and saying, let me add that to other games? What's your perspective on how you cross-pollinate between those?
Um, so it's interesting, right? I think in a lot of my own process, um, I'm specifically thinking about there is this kind of world building that I think is really neat. How do I make the rules that make someone feel like they're engaging with this thing fully? Like as you were like saying all of those things aloud, a thing emerged in my brain that I think is absolutely clever, so I'm gonna like mint it now. Writing a tabletop RPG is essentially speculative fiction technical writing, because you're essentially writing the manual for someone to perform the role of this thing. But the
Totally.
goal is always specifically how do you get someone to feel like they are present in this space? How do you make them feel like their stakes are real? How do you make them feel like their actions have weight instead of just making them feel like they are like um essentially just like riding the mecha that is another PC. How do they feel like they are actually in this story? And a lot of what I think about from a writing perspective is an RPG has to strike this very unique balance between very obviously communicating this is how you do the thing that you want to do and very dramatically communicating this is you doing it. The dice aren't doing this. This isn't happening in your head. It's happening. You are acting. Like it's why like a lot of like when you pick up a D&D book and flip to any like the beginning of any class section, they're still telling you how things are done, but they're telling you how you are doing it. And they're not telling you this is what's happening in the game. They're telling you this is what is happening in the world. And it's always about like trying to find the ways in which you trap someone in that feeling. And a lot of that is just purely language. Not just in terms of the language is responsible for making sure that people understand what's happening, but the language is responsible for making them understand that a thing is capital H happening and not just being imagined. Um, And like one of the things I was thinking about as I was actually talking to somebody about another project, um, was the fact that even the way that you refer to mechanical objects in the game, like the fact that, um, for instance, monks in D&D have key points. Already a very controversial set of framings
Yeah.
altogether.
Yeah.
But it
Hmm.
exists in that way specifically because someone thought the only way someone who has a tangential knowledge of what a monk is and can do is to relate it to the spirit, and then to relate it mechanically to this is the amount of times you can engage with your own spirit. Now, mind you, there are all kinds of other ways that you can express that, but they made that decision because they wanted the shortest route to do you understand how much times you can do this, and do you understand that you are doing it? Um, and it's always about trying to capture that experience as often as possible for everybody else as well. That you are not merely spending a resource or letting dice decide your fate. You are doing a thing and watching the consequences of that thing happen to you. In a very real and visceral sense, even with that distance of mechanics in front of you. And that's very tricky. But it becomes easier when you are accustomed to playing with the language of the tropes that are already happening in the space because you know what people are looking for and you know how to give them those things. Um, and I think that's one of the particular benefits of both speculative writing and poetry. I actually think that poetry is even stronger in that regard. Because I came into itch.io at the height of the lyric game phenomenon, where people were very interested in making very small, intensely poetically framed games where um the mechanical cost of entry is very low, and where the act of pursuing action is itself poetic, that you're not necessarily rolling dice, you're just doing the thing. Then when you do the thing, you have to accept the consequences of the thing that you've done. Um, and that's really freeing from a design perspective because it means that you're telling a player that you trust that I trust you to just know the story that you want to tell. And then the game is simply telling them this is what you are doing. Not this is what you do. This is what you are doing, and this is what is happening. And I think that leading into those touchstones very often and trusting a reader's capacity to engage with that poetically and artistically rather than mechanically is the way that you get them to lean into those tropes more often. And it's always freeing to see somebody do that, especially to see like we I'm sure you have the same feeling. I'm sure most designers who are also like GMs or players have this feeling when they watch someone who says they've never played an RPG, and you see that the thing happens in their brain, that they're not simply following instructions, but they're leaning into it. And the excitement that you get from watching that happen, um, is the same excitement I've realized that I get watching someone who goes up on a stage at an open mic saying, I have never read this poem aloud, and then seeing them beam at the reaction of other people telling them that shit was good. Both of those things meld together in my brain so rewardingly, and I'm glad to see those things also pay off across each other as well.
It's amazing to see, you're answering in many ways by demonstrating, frankly, both speculative fiction. We didn't even talk about poetry, so I'm glad you mentioned it. Uh, because what you're talking about is what I often call frame switching, right? Which is frame of reference is I'm a player, I'm reading a novel, I'm sitting somewhere, and if I need to use the bathroom, well, that frame is about me. That's a biological need. I need to get up and go do a thing. Or if I have to leave because my kid has to go somewhere, or my spouse, or somebody, my dog, I have to leave the game. That's my first frame. And then you get to your second frame, right, which is the game mechanics. And there are people who stop there. They do. I mean, that's we always laugh with the Dungeons and Dragons. There's group. I always want to fight monsters. I don't really want to have a conversation. I want to role play. I don't want to get into who I am in that character. I want to sort of move a figure around on a board. And, that is certainly a valid way to play. It's
Mhm.
not the full frame reference, but now you've got another frame. And then to your point, you get into the next frame, right? Now you're in that moment and you are that character and you're engaging with them. So now you're multiple frames in. And then, like I was laughing, we had our characters playing in a casino. So they were playing characters, people playing a game, playing characters playing a game, um,
Hmm.
which really got interesting. And then there was all kinds of drama in the game itself around the game, which is in another layer of game that they're playing, right? So you it's fascinating to see. And one of the reasons this has come up a lot is I work a lot with artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence does not get this. It is very confusing to
Hmm.
large language models what humans do, which is that we will switch frame of reference, as you and I do right now, and we'll talk about ourselves, and then we'll talk about a game, and then you can talk about the mechanics of the game, and then go right back to saying, by the way, I need to take a drink. And AI goes, did the character take a drink or did you take a drink? Like I don't understand because
Yeah.
when it's so fascinating to see that. So absolutely, I could see to your point, speculative fiction and poetry really gets that third frame. But as you mentioned, game design, it's technical writing. That's second frame, third frame, right? Of the two, where you're engaging in both some of the outside factors, because otherwise it's full make believe. We're just sort of vibing off each other. There's some randomness or something that makes it different. Doesn't mean there are games that you can do that, but you know, some kind of bounding. And then the actual being in the moment, which is the magic circle, right? We talk about that a lot of how amazing it can be when you've got people in the moment. And I was laughing, and it's funny because it hasn't happened in a while. I made a villain that everybody hated. And so I had all my players sort of mad at me, but they're
Hmm.
not mad at me, actually.
Yeah, but like, so that frame switching analogy is actually perfect to me. One, because it means that you know when things are working,
Mm-hmm.
when you know that when you look at your table and you see that your friends have stopped being players and started being their characters, because now you need to realize how to relate to them. And that example is particularly key because it's like the thing that also happens when people watch very good movies as well. Like you've seen people go on Twitter and say, I hate this actor. And it's like, homie, they just did the thing that you didn't like once on screen, but they did it so well that you cannot separate them anymore because
Right.
you were in that third frame when you saw it. But also the reason why I like that analogy is I think that that frame switching happens on the design level as well, because that first frame is the frame where you're simply writing rules, where your job is to simply tell people this is how you engage with the mechanics of the game. And then you get into the second frame, which is this is how you know what is happening in the world of this space. This is how we blend both of those things and be aware that both of those things are being blended as an act of play. And
Mm-hmm.
then the third frame on a design level is I am making a work of art and consuming it is an artistic endeavor. That this is not a rule book the way that you'd read a recipe book or the manual for a machine, but you are reading this book because you care about what is happening in the world that you can only make once you have followed its rules.
Absolutely. And it's funny, I've seen and it was used for Dungeons and Dragons, but I think it applies to many role-playing games. They said role-playing games are rules to make more role-playing games. That's what they do. Because every game is your game. So we'll give
Hmm.
you the tools. You'll get a guidebook potentially, but then what happens next is yours. It's absolutely unique because you're in it and you're experiencing it, and it's so fascinating to think about it that way. I mean, certainly with Dungeons and Dragons, it turns into a whole like campaign, the concept, but role playing games in general become your own by engaging with it actively. And when you engage in those multiple frames further in, it absolutely is yours. You're no longer sort of at that top level, kind of abstractly looking at it. So I love
No,
it. I mean, I
yeah.
think you certainly. I think what's fascinating is because of your background in speculative fiction and poetry, you are coming at it from that deeper framework that I don't know that everybody does. I think they start probably rules first and then sort of figure it out. So it's fascinating to see you go you right into the deep end. That's great.
No, because like I think what's interesting is I think that before I even started designing, I think that there was a trend to discover this exact same thing in a lot of design as well. And I can't remember for the life of me. I remember literally coming across this a couple of days ago, but there was like a game that was designed in the 80s. Um, one of like 3 or 4 games under a niche publisher where the premise of those games being published was they read like RPGs and they're describing themselves to you like RPGs, but the act of reading them and the act of playing them are separate because you read them very vividly, knowing this is attempting to like the game in particular that I remember having read was visibly trying to create this kind of ultra-violent post-apocalyptic kind of framing where any kind of brutal kind of gunplay you want to engage in is very easy to imagine how gritty and brutal it can be. And then when you get to the act of attempting to play it, it is mechanically unfunctional.
Hole, hole, HOL.
Yes.
That's
I'm like,
yep.
this is grand because that's like pure third frame. That's giving it to players where the act of playing is happening purely in their own heads. They're
I
visualizing the story, they're engaging very deeply with the fact that this is an RPG while constantly creating their own characters and imagining their own scenarios, and it can never sit down in front of a table and make. Like, it will never work. And that's delightful to me in the same way that lyric games are delightful to me because you could just hand it to someone who's never rolled a die before in a game and go, just do what the book says. And just leave this room and just continue following instructions. And you will have played a game. And then you get to come back and go, well, how do I feel about this thing that I've done? Like one of the most fascinating I've like in classrooms with people who ask me about tabletop design. I talk a lot about um a game that I read on itch.io called We Are But Worms. Um the instructions of which is just one word, writhe. And you get to just take that, you just get to take that game and go, okay, I'm doing the thing. I'm doing the thing. I'm doing the thing right now. How do I feel about? And then you start to stop and ask yourself, well, what does this mean? Uh, how do I feel? How do worms feel? Am I developing the consciousness of a worm? Like, and all of these are like high level, like you're essentially asking the comic version of the real pure question that the game is asking. But asking that question is still the act of play. And all of those things are really rad to me. In much the same way that reading this game, reading HOL is like, I can't roll a die for this game, but reading the game is playing the game because they wrote it for me to read for a reason, for me to imagine as an RPG for a reason.
right. Yeah, and shifting gears a little bit because you did write a game called A Nice Hobby,
I
right?
did.
So it feels like this is a little bit of that meta sort of frame. So can you speak a
Yeah.
little bit about that? Because A Nice Hobby is sort of in this sweet spot of like it's a game about people who play a game who are sort of bonding together in their hobby. And
Yeah. A Nice Hobby is a very unique game for me because I wrote it after thinking a lot about um several TV shows and anime that I had seen previously. Like, you know how Yu-Gi-Oh is just an anime about a card game and then and at any point in time when you're watching a season of Yu-Gi-Oh at episode 20 episode 3 it's about our protagonist needs to get to the finals of this game but his rival is opposing him today. Will he triumph in this round or not? And then by episode 20 you're like, the Demon King has arisen because you played the wrong card in this game and is going to eat all of the souls of your friends. Can you defeat the Demon King in a game of cards? Um, and that's how A Nice Hobby materialized as a concept, but a lot of it is also it's written in that to revisit that frame switching analogy. It's written from the perspective of someone who does not know that anything has gone wrong. The opening instructions are just this is how you make a character because this thing that we're doing is fun and I want to thoroughly equip you to know how to continue doing this fun thing. And then at page 6, like page 5 or 6 in the game, the text literally says, I'm sorry. And then you learn how to play the game because the game is now telling you you're going to suffer a great deal of emotional trauma. Learning that the game that you thought you were having fun playing is bad for you. But these are your only friends because you met them thinking that this game was fun and they actually care about you. And you can't give this up because you're good at it. And these people actually matter to you. And that's like really cool to me as a premise, and I like being able to create that space where someone can imagine both of those things at once, being
Mhm.
a player who knows that the story that you're telling is a tragic one from the perspective of a character who does not.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Um, so we could look. We take the whole time just talking about frames, but before I don't want to get too far because we can come back to that. You've written a bunch of games.
Mhm.
Not again, not surprising. Someone from speculative fiction and poetry has quite a bit of it feels to me at least you don't feel bound by any sort of genre or constraints, which I think is fantastic. And that in itself is diverse, right? So I think that's wonderful. It's a fresh voice, and you're approaching it sort of from much wider perspective than sort of what tends to be a war game kind of mindset that we often struggle with. So how do you promote diverse and inclusive narratives using these frames, right? A nice hobby mentions queer teenagers. What is there any other games that I can see the list here, a couple of them, but if you'd like to talk a little bit about what you've done in that space, we'd love to hear it.
So I think first and foremost, what comes up in my games a lot is simply the idea that I am equipping players to tell stories of people who are not themselves, and
Mhm.
that your goal is not to think about, am I getting this perfectly or not, but simply to visit the thing, to simply embody the thing as deeply as possible. And a lot of the things that kind of drive that for me are what I consider like the better examples of how you promote those narratives in play. Like one of the things that I still enjoy a lot about, for instance, Dream Askew and Dream Apart by Avery Alda and Benjamin Rosenbaum, or Coyote and Crow, um, are that they open by obviously letting you know you are playing marginalized people in a world that considers them marginalized, and then deliberately explaining to the player, okay, some of you are going to, as a natural result of playing this game, you're going to be put in a position where you have to play someone who is not you. Once you're not being an ass, that's not our business. um like I think about it the same way we think about like the dichotomy of whether rules matter fundamentally in gameplay overall, which is I am never going to come to your dining table and get in a fight with you because you're not doing the thing that I told you. All that matters is I've given you these tools with which you can tell the most possibly empowering story that you can tell, and giving you guidance on how you can tell it. If you want to tell it, you will get a very rewarding experience out of that process. If you don't want to tell a healthy, productive, compelling story, I already still have $20 from you when you bought this book, which is mean. But ultimately, the goal is I am empowering you to care about someone who is not you. Because when you hit that third frame, you're supposed to be this person. You're supposed to think more deeply and more compassionately from this person's perspective than you did when you started crafting them, even. You're supposed to start learning things and discovering things about their world and about their relationship to it that should start enlivening you even more in the process of play. Um, and I think from that play perspective, the goal should always be to create more opportunities for people to discover things that they have never discovered, because that's what we make the games for. Like, no one's going to space. I am never, ever going to. like find myself on one of the planets on the outer worlds of Starfinder, um, and like talk to any of these creatures. But pretending that I can is fun, and we want to make that the most dramatically rewarding that it can possibly be because you already bought into the fun. We can do that for all kinds of other things, even otherwise perfectly mundane things. You can make like games about things that are happening in real life with that same kind of drama. And therefore, the goal is to help you imagine that same compassion you're giving to yourself as an elf, to yourself as dragonborn, to yourself as a tiefling. You can give to a queer person, a black person. And nobody else needs to even know that that's what you're doing because you're just playing with your friends. But you should come out of that learning something more radical about the way that you relate to the world and the way that other people relate to the world through that play. But from the design perspective, from the overall production perspective, the thing that is ultimately more important than that is making sure the people who are crafting those experiences are themselves from those communities. Again, I'm an Afro-Caribbean writer and game designer presently living and working in Trinidad and Tobago. I shouldn't have to move to New York to get published, and I shouldn't have to move to Oregon to make a game. And no one else should either. And I'm very grateful that a great deal of both the publishing and the game design communities get that because um there are communities like Con or Bust, which I'm lucky enough to be on the board of, that is advocating for people to be able to attend more conventions, to attend more professional events, so they can not only raise their own profile, get their own work out there, but just make those spaces less homogenous and more diverse by ensuring that people get to be present. And spaces like Big Bad Con are doing the exact same thing for tabletop RPGs, making sure that people know that there are brilliant designers all over the world, queer designers, designers of color, who are already making cool shit. And you could support the things that they're already making while also ensuring that they get more opportunities to grow in the field. And I think that those things are valuable. And I think that um, while it's obviously very empowering to know that those communities and those spaces already exist to lift those people up, more obviously needs to be done, not because the work that is being done is deficient, but because there is still um, harassment and diminishment and a large pushback against those communities being present that can only be overcome by making our presence commonplace. People think that we're invading, we have always been here, but some of those people won't notice until they can constantly see us. And making sure that we can constantly be seen is part of their work.
That's huge. And it's interesting, it's always fascinating to me. Role playing is putting yourself in someone's shoes, right? So there's your frame, there's your framing.
Mhm.
But boy, turned out
I
to what
mean,
be a lot harder than we thought for some reason when
to
you're like,
be
but
no,
you role play other people. Like,
yeah,
what?
like the hard part is in what you say. Some people, and this is a very small minority, and I'm not even judging them because they're doing the thing that comes first to them as fun. But ultimately, it still needs be said that a small community of people like playing in someone's shoes simply because they want to get someone else's shoes dirty without having to think about their own shoes. Whereas the rest of us want to know what's at the end of the mile of walking in their shoes, and creating the opportunity where both of those things can be rewarding ultimately, where you can get into this process. Like the dream, I think, for everybody, but specifically for me, is always to make a game that someone picks up going, "Ooh, I'm sure I'll have some fun just getting in some hijinks for an hour and then putting it down 3 hours later and going, I think I'm feeling things." I don't know how to process the feelings that I'm having. So I'm gonna guess I guess I have to keep playing this thing to discover how I feel even more. I think that's what everybody wants to get. That somebody will play a thing because they think that it is wildly entertaining and learn that part of the entertainment is wholesome and holistic and deep and critical and thoughtful. And that they're discovering things about themselves through the act of play. And whether it's a particularly intense and dramatic thing or just a nice hobby where the goal is to discover that a nice hobby is probably not really that nice or all parts of that process. And I'm glad to be in conversation with other people who are doing those cool things better than I am, and bringing other people into their spaces as a result.
Fantastic. Again, not surprised at all, given your background. I think it's amazing. But I don't know if you've ever heard of The Better Angels of Our Nature by Pinker.
Hmm.
Um, that book, it's a hard book to read, but it's fascinating because he talks about how it used to be you couldn't have knives at a table when people sat down to dinner because they would take the knife and slit each other's nostrils. Like it was literally like people were that violent that you had to be worried about having a knife at a table in medieval times. And his theory is that when people started reading, you created a new frame because you then had the ability to project and empathize as another person. And once reading became widespread, it actually created a level of empathy. I'm sure there were people who obviously experienced that, but you really couldn't do it in a way that was accessible. And you sort of had this idea of this new frame that people were able to get into because they could imagine not themselves day to day.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because I think role playing goes beyond that, right? So now we're past just reading, because to your point, like you can be really excited about a book, right? I talk about this too, where you just have this amazing movie experience or something. But now you're doing it with someone else, and it's sort of a collaborative, shared hallucination in some ways. So it really, it's absolutely amazing, and I think to your point, it's a natural evolution that you would hope we would welcome people of all experiences. Um, and
Hmm.
that's part of I don't know how you can say you can be whatever you want in a game and then go, but not you, you know. But
Yeah.
it does. I mean, we know that happens partially because people bring their own limitations to role play too. I mean, hopefully you explore them, but they unfortunately bring, if you bring yourself, that whole self, good, bad, indifferent comes with you. And I think, hopefully, like you said, the more exposure you have, the more you can flex some of these things that may have been built in. I've talked about a lot of work role play where there's different exercises and events where we've seen people, they have to imagine being an executive, imagine dealing with a strike, imagine dealing with a workplace violence scenario or a safety issue. And I've seen people very upset by it, like seriously unhappy because they've never gone outside their main frame.
Hmm.
And gamers are like, "What do you mean? I do that like literally every 5 minutes if I can. I'm switching frames and I'm thinking deeper or further around." But there are absolutely people who don't. And it is
Yeah.
fascinating to see that there are folks who don't think about that. There's people who don't read. There's people who don't do this stuff. So it's always amazing to me, just how much opportunity we have and sort of how many opportunities we have to bring folks, even when we think, oh, well, I'm a gamer, so I'm open-minded. There's so much opportunity, and
I
diversity
mean,
of experience.
yeah, like and again, this is not me judging anybody. Everybody is finding their joy somewhere in the hobby. But I think a lot of it is a kind of um blowback from the history of the space that when we started like codifying RPGs as a space, we started with wargaming, and a lot of the wargaming process is still an act of play. That when people think of a big box RPG, when people think of a hardcover RPG sliding off a shelf, they're thinking of the game where you and a group of adventurers go into hostile territories and slay things.
Hmm?
And that can be very viscerally cool, obviously, but it's also ripe with drama. And then when you think very deeply about the drama that can happen in those spaces, why are we at war? Did I need to kill this person to solve this problem? Um, am I socially unequipped to resolve this problem via diplomacy? And if I am, what does that say about me or my community? How do I reckon with my community? How do we reckon with other communities? Comes other very novel interactions that come from other games that are already in the same space. Like there are fantasy games where you are still a quote unquote adventurer, but your opening class has no combat skills. You're a farmer, you're a butcher, you are a trained diplomat with no combat acumen whatsoever. You are just someone's kid. And then you think even more deeply about, well, what does it mean to play a game when you are not the person who has political or force agency in the world, when you are not essentially a nobleman or a cop in this fantasy world? What are you? And then how are the stakes real for you, and how do you solve problems even if you still have to kill things? And even beyond that, you get to ask even more interesting questions as a result. And when even if you think that your goal as a gamer is to chase cool experiences, I would challenge anyone who has ever seen a game that they went, I have no idea how I'm supposed to get joy out of this game, to go, what if the joy is drama? What if the thing you're supposed to get out of this is simply going, I don't have the tools to solve this problem and a problem has arisen. What am I going to do? Because that's grand to me. There is, and I didn't even plan to mention these games, but there are a group of two-player games on my itch.io that opens with the first of those games is The Moon Wants Me to Leave You.
Yeah.
And the entire premise is simply you are going on a date. One of you is prepared to have the night of your life. You are going on a date with the person that you've had a crush on for months to years now. They finally said yes. You're like, okay, this is the moment when I'm finally going to confess that I really want us to be together. I'm going to make sure that this is the best night of our lives. The other of you is probably a werewolf or an eldritch entity from another universe. And you are absolutely worried that tonight is the night everybody is going to realize that you're not supposed to be here and either exile or kill you. And you are just waiting to find out whether the person in front of you is someone you can trust or not. Because that means you're either leaving together or leaving alone. The end state of the game is a bad date all the time, but discovering what that means for you as a character, or even you as a player, if you're already in a relationship, or if you are, I hope not, but if you are playing this game with somebody that you really wanted to actually go on a date with, like, um, how do you reckon the fact that this will always go badly and still be hopeful that love will win, be the most open and empathetic version of yourself, knowing as a player that something's going to go badly, but being invested as a character in making sure that you can still get something beautiful out of this experience. And I think that's one of the grandest things that I've ever made, and the game is broken. The game is actually kind of unfunctional near the end. But I like that I made that because I like that goal. And I think that more people should, and I don't even say this like this is a limitation of the people in tabletop spaces, but I do want people to embrace as deeply as possible that chasing the experience that you didn't know was going to be fun will sometimes be the most fun that you've ever had, doing a thing that you would have never done otherwise. And that's why we're here, to chase that other experience. We should be racking up new play experiences as often as possible. We should be willing to go as often as possible outside of our TTRPG comfort zone to discover new ways to play games and new ways to be ourselves as often as possible.
Love it. One of the experience that reminds me of is Tim Hutchings, who is a CAR-PGA member and one of my buddies,
Mm-hmm.
who I've known for a while, and he wrote Thousand Year Old Vampire, and playing through
Mm-hmm.
Thousand Year Old Vampire was tough for me, because it I saw as someone who has aging parents, it was very much about loss of memory and how even when you write things down, because there are the game essentially encourages you to be this creature who lives a long time and then rips it away in pieces over time,
Mhm.
and accidents and things happen, and your character, it creates this element of feeling like you are old. And it's funny, I told Tim that, and he was like, "What?" I was like, "Yeah, it's like aging. You're taking someone through the aging process. You're stretching it out over 1,000 years, but as a player, you're feeling what it's like to age and forget and have people die that you love and a bunch of other stuff. And it was really emotional. But and again, did not expect that from a game called Thousand-Year-Old Vampires. So I think that's fantastic. We could talk about that forever too. I do want to get to some of
Mhm.
your games. So let's give you the chance because I don't want to just focus. We had one we were going to mention, but tell me, you said there's something cool going on that you're working on. So this is your chance. What are you working on that's coming up next in the role playing games or whatever space you want to share? We'd love to hear it.
Mhm. So I'm actually admittedly working on a great deal of things, but I will mention two things that are particularly important to me, which is I am presently in the latest stages of the mechanics writing for a game called Grey Shade, which is um based on the Grey Assassin trilogy by Gregory A. Wilson that was recently kickstarted a couple of years ago. Its latest novel, Heretic, should be coming out sometime later this year or early next year, in fact. We've been working on that game for um the better part of a year and a half up to this point. Really excited about some of the things that are coming out there, and I want to make sure that people get an opportunity to support Grey Shade because the books are also very cool. That is a uh dark fantasy RPG about uh uh a very curiously religiously powered setting where the influences of various religious orders have overwhelmed the way that people think about not only personally having faith but engaging politically in the world. In the novels, the protagonist is an acolyte of one of those orders who has his own crisis of faith, struggling with the morally dubious actions that he has taken and deciding to strike out into the world and see if he can learn more about his order and his own place in the world as a result. So a lot of the game, even though it's still very heavily powered by 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, is playing a lot with new mechanics around how individual characters perceive their own faith and how that faith interacts socially with other parts of the world. So we're very intrigued to see what that will look like. Playtesting should be happening very soon. But also today, which I thought was going to happen earlier in the week, but it happened literally this afternoon. Um, Evil Hat announced that they are publishing the official Tomb Raider RPG in collaboration with
For
Crystal
that.
Dynamics, and I am one of its contributing designers. I'm very excited about that. I can't say much more about what I'm presently working on, obviously, but the lead designer of the Tomb Raider RPG is Ray Nejati, who previously did Apocalypse Keys. Um, I think Ray is brilliant. The personal decisions that they've made in terms of character classes and how people interact with the larger act of raiding in the world is so cool. I like that the game is forwardly trying to admit that it's trying to shed some of the colonial framing of you are a bunch of strangers rolling into the third world and trying to loot all of its
Yeah.
special
Yeah.
places of all of its special artifacts. So bringing more people of color on board to be in the process of writing some of those adventures and some of those locations and thinking more deeply about how those mechanics work is so cool. In particular, I like that a lot of the interaction between character classes in the game is also very rich with drama and pathos, that you are someone who is very good at what you do and got here because at some point you were really interested in learning more about the world, or you were genuinely hoping to get rich. raiding very fancy places of all of their gold and all of their jewelry, and then you had a crisis at some point that reveals something more deeply about you, and engaging with that emotional place is what empowers your abilities as well in very fascinating ways. So I can't wait for people to actually get to play Tomb Raider. I can't wait to finish my adventure because I've been thinking about it for so long that like it's getting bigger in my brain. But suffice it to say, um, I'm very excited for people to get to interact with that as well. So yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's of course I saw this because it was on N World and I did not catch your name in there, so I apologize. But congratulations, that's fantastic.
Hmm.
Very well. We're gonna say we knew you went. Not that you weren't famous to begin with, but boy, you are blowing up. This is a
Yeah, like this is a big deal. I think that it's rad. Like, I'm not even saying this because obviously I'm excited to be working on a thing that is as big as this, but I think that it's also very cool that Tomb Raider is getting a tabletop RPG. And it goes back again to the framing conversation, right? It's very easy to be distant from the idea that you are engaging in what is essentially colonial pillaging of these territories because you're distant from Lara. It's just look, Lara did it. Lara's just the badass Tomb Raider who shot everybody in the head and fled. Um, but it's actually really much more intriguing to ask the question that the later Lara Croft games have been asking, which is you are here because you value the things that you can learn from other cultures, but those things have price tags. Those things have heavy spiritual and emotional debts attached to them that were not your business when you got here. So are you working to make things better than when you left it? Or are you working to make things worse? And I think that putting players in the position where they have to actively make those decisions and actively make those decisions against their own character's pathos is really rich to me. And I can't wait for people who otherwise would say, I'm just into Tomb Raider because I really like being able to climb this cliff or shoot this person in the head with a crossbow. To go, I think I've learned something about these parts of the world that I've never been to, or about how people who value their own cultural artifacts have to constantly like struggle against a world that values them because they are priceless. Because they have price rather than because they are priceless.
And this is, of course, the challenge that every museum, I support the Smithsonian and they have a council and they're, repatriating artifacts and a bunch of other stuff where everybody's just been going, I don't think this is ethically sustainable anymore,
No,
because
yeah.
someone took it from somebody. And it's fascinating that the Indiana Jones franchise keeps creaking along because you're like, really? We had an event once where we were bringing all of our teams globally because I work for a multinational company, and they want to do an Indiana Jones episode, like because it was in Disney, and I was like, I don't think this like it just doesn't hold up
Hmm.
internationally.
Yeah.
Do you understand that? But it is
Like,
funny because like you said, the genre, and by the way, those roots run deep, right? So it's right in the word Tomb Raider. So Tomb Raider certainly inspired by Indiana Jones and a lot of those other scenarios. But that was when you see Indiana Jones yell, that belongs in a museum.
maybe no.
That's what people thought, that's what museums thought, right, at the time.
Yeah.
So it's a different world, but and what an amazing opportunity to revisit it but still acknowledging its roots, right? I mean, you're not
Yeah.
changing the name.
No, because ultimately that's like this is like the pinnacle of the thing that I described, right? You're still doing all of the things that are fun. We're still gonna give you guns, we're still gonna give you gadgets, you're still gonna climb mountains, we're still gonna put you in positions where being thoughtfully investigative is gonna pay off in rewarding, talented ways. And we're still gonna obviously give you opportunities where you get to prove that you know or are the only person who can learn deep, unfathomable things about cultures that you otherwise wouldn't know anything about. You're just doing it for those cultures. And I think that that touch is like uniquely eye-opening in a way. Like I'm not judging anybody for again, I keep saying that, but I really am not. I really don't want people to think that this is coming from a place of hostility about the past. In the 90s, when Indiana Jones says this belongs in a museum, he's speaking from a space of conservation that existed in the 90s. We don't want this to disappear. We don't want this to end up on some rich billionaire's mantelpiece, consuming dust as a marker of his bravado or his riches.
Hmm?
We want people to know that they can learn something from this thing. And now we are in the point where we have learned that the only way that you can truly learn and understand from those cultures is by speaking to the cultures themselves. And I think empowering people to do those things is more radical than the opposite. And I think that we are in a beautiful place, tabletop wise, to create those kinds of experiences for people.
Fantastic. So as we're wrapping up here, because we could, again, I know we could talk about this topic again for another
I
hour.
literally just saw the time and I was like, we could keep going. I don't have anything in a little bit.
Where can we follow and keep up with you? You're everywhere, but I want to find a few places where we should point people
I am
to keep up with
definitely
you.
everywhere. I try to make it very easy. I am on most social media at The Rising Tides. That's TheRisingTides. But I also have a website, which is also my newsletter, brandonobrien.xyz. So not only will my blog be there, and that's where you'll have links to all of my other social media, but if you sign up for my newsletter, right there, you will get to hear some of my work, hear some of my thoughts about speculative fiction writing, about poetry, about game design, about being in the creative industries writ large, in the internet age. And sometimes see screenshots of whatever game I'm playing on my mobile phone. Um, but yeah, and for some of the other content that I'm doing, obviously, I also do speculative fiction review and commentary podcasts at the Skiffy and Fanty show, which you can find at skiffyandfanty.com. And I do tabletop actual play with Speculate, which you can find more information about at speculatesf.com. And both of those are also on Twitter, Instagram, and Mastodon as well. So yeah, that's most of me.
Few places. Well, what we'll do is I will try, I'm going to find them. I'm going to ask you again. You're going to hopefully
Mhm.
give me those links.
I'll give you all of those links, good God.
Yes.
I'm on so much social media. When people were fleeing what seemed to be the burning ship that was formerly called Twitter, there was a mad grab to go everywhere, and I was like, you know what solve everyone's problem? If I just booked one everywhere and just told people you can find me on my website. So yeah, that's primarily how that works.
That's smart. That's smart. Yeah, but we absolutely put that all into the show notes, and we'll put it in our newsletter as well. So we'll make sure everyone can follow along. Obviously, you've got two new pieces of content coming that is very exciting. So we're going to be following it anyway. There's no way Tomb Raider alone is going to not be excitedly watched, I think. So I think this is fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. I
Thank you
really
for having
appreciate it.
me.
This is absolutely we never know what we're going to discuss, right? So I sort of give an outline. We sort of have an idea, but we definitely took it in a direction that I thought was
Mhm.
so thoughtful and wonderful to hear your perspective. So, but you are absolutely. I adore the work you're doing. I think what you're doing is fantastic. It's clear. You are the right person for the job, and I'm very excited to see what comes next.
Thank you so very much. I'm very
Thank
grateful
you.
that you have such high hopes for my work.
No
I'll try
pressure.
to I'll try to live up to them as much as possible. But yes, thank you so very much for having me here. This was rad. I hope for everybody who is watching slash listening, I please support the CAR-PGA. E- Empowering more people to have these kinds of conversations and to just generally continue promoting the kind of work that we can do as designers, but also as players, also as actual play producers and further is actually really rad. So I'm glad to be here, and I hope that everybody keeps letting you do the work that you do.
Thank you. Well, yeah, you did better than I could. Thank you for that advertisement. I appreciate it. Don't go anywhere. We're going to stop the recording, but thank you again. I really thank you for your time, Brandon.
Thank you.